The story opens in 1999, when an old man named Paul lives in a nursing home. One afternoon, while he and other residents are watching television, an old movie titled Heaven suddenly appears on the screen. The moment Paul sees it, he looks deeply shaken. He rises from his chair and walks outside, followed by his friend named Elaine. Elaine realizes that the movie has brought back painful memories for Paul. When he asks about it, Paul begins to tell the story of his youth, specifically the time when he worked as the head guard at Cold Mountain Prison during the Great Depression. His duty was to supervise the prisoners awaiting execution in a special block known as the Green Mile, named so because the corridor floor was covered in green tiles. One day, a truck stopped at the prison, bringing in a new inmate who was to be executed. At the same time, young Paul was suffering from a urinary tract infection that caused him great pain every time he went to the bathroom. Despite that, he continued leading his fellow guards, David, Dean, Harry, and Percy. Soon after, David informed him that the new prisoner had arrived. The man was escorted by Percy, an arrogant and cruel guard. Along the way, Percy arrogantly shouted that they were bringing in a man who was already as good as dead, which angered the other guards. When the new inmate entered the block, everyone was stunned by his enormous size. His name was John Coffey. Yet when Paul looked into his face, what he saw was not the expression of a murderer, but rather an innocent and gentle look. Percy, wanting to assert his authority, shoved John hard in the chest. Paul immediately scolded him and ordered Percy to handle other tasks. Edward Delacroix, one of the prisoners, laughed at Percy, which made Percy furious. In his rage, he punched the iron wall and broke his own fingers. Paul became even more irritated and ordered him to leave the block. After things calmed down, Paul read John Coffey's file and introduced him to the other guards. As he was about to leave the cell, John politely asked that the lights not be turned off because he was afraid of the dark. He even extended his hand to shake Paul's, something strange for someone accused of such a brutal crime. When the cell door was closed, John looked sad and murmured that he had tried to help, but it was too late. That night, Paul studied John's file more carefully. From the report, it was revealed that John had been accused of murdering 2 little girls in Louisiana. When it happened, the family panicked after realizing their children were missing.
Oh God, please! Somebody took my little girls!
The father, neighbors, and police began searching until they found a bloodied doll. Shortly after, they discovered John covered in blood, crying, and holding the lifeless bodies of the girls. The father attacked him in anger, beating him severely. John could only say that he had tried to save them, but it was too late. The police then arrested him and charged him with murder. Hearing all that, Paul felt deeply unsettled and found it hard to believe that John could commit such a heinous act. When he got home, Paul told his wife about the oddness surrounding John's case. The next day, he and Dean were cleaning the electric chair when they heard David laughing. They went to see what was happening and found a small mouse coming out of the isolation room. Strangely, the mouse was not afraid of humans and even seemed friendly. David gave it a biscuit, and the little creature ran back into the isolation room. Paul worried that the mouse could cause problems, so he asked that it be caught. But when they checked the empty storeroom, the mouse was nowhere to be found.
Outsmarted by the mouse.
The next day, while Percy was combing his hair, the mouse appeared again behind him. Startled, Percy tried to kill it by throwing things, but the mouse escaped back into the isolation room. Percy went inside to search again but still couldn't find it. Paul stepped in to calm things down and warned Percy not to cause trouble in the execution block, but Percy got angry and threatened to use his family connections to have Paul fired.
Care ward of a hospital.
This made David furious and he nearly attacked Percy, but Paul intervened just in time. Firmly, Paul warned Percy that if he dared to continue his threats, he would have to face the consequences himself. A few days later, they conducted a rehearsal for the upcoming execution of a prisoner named Arlen Bitterbuck. Percy asked why a wet sponge was always placed on the prisoner's head, and it was explained that it helped the electricity flow quickly to the brain to minimize suffering. After the rehearsal ended, the real execution took place. Arlen had a long conversation with Paul before being led into the execution room in front of many witnesses.
Arlen Bitterbuck, electricity.
When the current was applied, Arlen's body convulsed, but when the doctor checked him, he was still alive and had to be shocked again.
Again?
David hesitated but eventually completed the second charge, ensuring Arlen's death. Afterward, Percy deliberately insulted Arlen's corpse, which angered David, who scolded him to show respect for the dead. Not long after, Paul asked Percy why he refused the job offer at a mental hospital that paid more. Percy replied that he wanted to experience executing a person before transferring to Briar Ridge Asylum. This made it even clearer that Percy enjoyed seeing others suffer. Paul thought perhaps he could give Percy that opportunity, but only if Percy changed his attitude. The next day, the guards noticed that Edward Delacroix had become very close with the little mouse. He had trained it to perform simple tricks and even named it Mr. Jingles. The creature was clever and gentle, which amazed everyone. Percy seemed more cheerful this time and even offered to find a small box to serve as Mr. Jingles' home. That afternoon, Paul met with the warden, Hal, who was in despair because his wife had just been diagnosed with a fatal brain tumor. Hal was torn about how to tell his wife that she didn't have long to live. That night, Paul woke up in agony as his infection worsened. He went outside and lay on a pile of wood, unable to bear the pain. The next morning, a new prisoner named Wild Bill was brought to the prison by Harry, Dean, and Percy. Beforehand, Wild Bill had been sedated at the asylum. When the group arrived, Paul was already waiting at the block. From behind the bars, John Coffey whispered a warning for them to be careful. Sure enough, as soon as they arrived, Wild Bill suddenly attacked. He elbowed Percy in the face and strangled Dean with his handcuffs. Paul tried to intervene, but Wild Bill kicked him hard in the groin, sending him to the ground in pain. Struggling to stand, Paul pointed his gun but couldn't get a clear shot because Wild Bill was holding Dean too close. Paul ordered Percy to attack Wild Bill, but Percy froze in fear. Fortunately, David arrived and struck Wild Bill on the head, knocking him down.
Go, brother. Yeah! Piss on me.
After they managed to lock Wild Bill in Zelda, Paul was left alone in the prison hall, where he began to feel excruciating pain from his urinary infection and collapsed onto the floor. John saw Paul in pain and asked the guards to bring him closer. Hesitantly, Paul approached Zelda where John was being held, and the large man immediately reached out and grabbed Paul firmly in the groin. Paul tried to pull out his gun but stopped when he felt something strange happening. A few seconds later, John released him and began coughing violently. A swarm of black insects flew out of John's mouth as he said that he had taken the sickness out of Paul's body and now felt very tired. Paul asked what he had just done, and John replied that he only wanted to help before falling asleep from exhaustion. Afterward, Paul went to the bathroom and was relieved to find that the pain was gone and he could urinate normally again. John had truly healed him. Realizing that John possessed a miraculous healing ability, Paul told his wife about it. He was convinced that John could not have committed the horrible crime he was accused of, so he went to see John's lawyer, Bert Hammer-Smith, who had represented him in court. Paul asked whether the police had found any criminal record on John, but Bert explained that the police found nothing, not even in his personal history. Bert commented that John seemed like someone who had fallen from the sky without any identity. From that conversation, Paul realized that Hammer-Smith was actually a racist who had never truly intended to defend John. The next day, as a token of gratitude, Paul brought cornbread baked by his wife for John. John happily accepted it and shared it with Edward and Mr. Jingles. But suddenly, Wild Bill grabbed Percy from behind and began choking him. Moments later, he released Percy and said he was just joking, though he added something that terrified Percy. As a result, Percy was so frightened that he wet himself. Humiliated, he threatened everyone not to speak of what had happened, or they would lose their jobs. Even so, Edward, who had often been the target of Percy's mockery, couldn't hold back his laughter. Out of revenge, Percy stomped on Mr. Jingles and walked away. Edward cried hysterically seeing his beloved mouse dying. John then asked that the mouse be given to him, believing he might be able to save it. Paul handed Mr. Jingles to John, who then performed his healing before everyone's eyes. Just like before, a swarm of black insects flew out of John's mouth, and Mr. Jingles came back to life as if nothing had ever happened.
Look at the tail.
The guards were deeply moved by what they witnessed, and their belief in John's healing power grew even stronger. A few days later, it was time for Edward's execution. Before being executed, Edward asked Paul to take care of Mr. Jingles. But Paul couldn't bring the mouse into the execution room, so John offered to look after it until everything was over. Edward was then strapped into the electric chair. He apologized for his crimes and wished he had never committed them. The guards were filled with emotion, but Percy deliberately taunted Edward, saying that no one would care for Mr. Jingles after he died, making Edward even more heartbroken. When it was time to place the wet sponge on Edward's head, Percy pretended to soak it in the bucket but actually used a dry one. Paul grew suspicious when he noticed the floor wasn't wet, but before he could stop it, Percy gave the signal to pull the lever. Because the sponge was dry, Edward's body suffered terribly as the electricity surged through him. The witnesses screamed in horror, and David begged Paul to cut the power, but Paul knew that doing so would only prolong Edward's agony. Flames began to rise from Edward's body, and though Percy panicked, Paul forced him to watch the result of his cruelty. When the gruesome execution was finally over, David lost control and punched Percy. When Warden Hal arrived and asked what had happened, Percy only said he didn't know the sponge had to be wet first. Paul then reminded Percy of his promise to transfer to the mental hospital and ordered him to get out of the prison immediately. Afterward, Paul returned to Zelda and found John crying over Edward's death. The next day, Paul and his wife visited Warden Hal's house to see his wife's condition. Hal said that her health was getting worse, and from that moment, Paul came up with a daring idea. Back home, he discussed it with his team, telling them how John had healed both Mr. Jingles and his own infection. He then proposed that they secretly sneak John out to heal the warden's wife. At first, everyone refused because of the enormous risk that could send them to prison, but in the end, they agreed to do it to save her life. To make sure their plan wouldn't be exposed, they locked Percy in the isolation room as punishment for what he did during Edward's execution. Once everything was ready, they began the plan. But before leaving, Wild Bill touched John's hand, and immediately, John had a vision of Wild Bill's crimes. Paul quickly pulled Wild Bill's hand away from John and escorted John out of the prison. As soon as he breathed the open air, John looked overjoyed like a child. He gazed up at the stars and felt the grass beneath his feet. Eventually, they arrived at Warden Hal's house. Hal was shocked to see Paul and his team arriving with John. At first, he felt uneasy seeing a prisoner brought to his home, but John calmly approached him and said he could help. John then approached the warden's wife, who was trembling as if possessed by something evil. He sat quietly before her, spoke gently, and slowly leaned his head toward her. Suddenly, a bright white light flowed out of her mouth and was absorbed into John's body. The clock on the wall shattered, the whole room shook, and once again a miracle occurred. Not long after, the color returned to the woman's face, and the sickness that had consumed her vanished completely. Seeing his wife cured and alive, Warden Hal broke down in tears. But this time, John did not release the black insects as before. Instead, he swallowed them back into his body. The woman rose from her bed and said she had seen John before in her dreams. She then took off her necklace and gave it to him as a token of gratitude. Moments later, the exhausted John was taken back to the prison to rest. Not long after, Paul and David released Percy on the condition that he would truly quit being a prison guard. But just after Percy was freed, John finally released the black insects from his body, which immediately flew into Percy's mouth. Instantly, Percy became like a man possessed, his eyes blank and his movements lifeless. He walked straight to Wild Bill's cell, raised his gun, and shot him dead without hesitation. Paul then went to John and asked why he had let Percy be possessed and made him kill Wild Bill. John explained that when Wild Bill touched his hand, he had a vision of Wild Bill's evil deeds. It turned out that Wild Bill was the one who had actually attacked and murdered the two little girls, while John had only tried to bring them back to life. That was why John allowed the insects to use Percy's body because, in his view, it was one wicked man punishing another wicked man. After that incident, Percy was never the same again and was eventually committed to the mental hospital, the very place he was supposed to work in from the start. When Paul returned home, he talked to his wife about the great moral dilemma he was facing. He was convinced that John was innocent, yet there was nothing he could do to save him from execution. As the day of execution drew near, Paul spoke with John and asked if he wanted to escape from prison. Paul told him that if he allowed the execution to happen, he didn't know how he could ever justify it before God. But John calmly replied that he didn't want to run away. He said he was tired of the endless suffering of life and just wanted it all to end. When David asked if John had any last requests, John said that he had never seen a movie before. To fulfill his wish, he was allowed to watch one, the same movie that Paul would later watch as an old man at the beginning of the story. A few days later, the day of John's execution arrived. He was brought into the execution room, where the witnesses were already gathered, including the parents of the 2 little girls who had actually been killed by Wild Bill. John was terrified as he saw the hateful faces staring at him, but David comforted him and told him to focus on the guards, who had become his true friends. As John was strapped into the electric chair, the guards could not hold back their tears. When the hood was about to be placed over his face, John begged Paul not to cover him with the black cloth because he was so afraid of the dark. Paul honored his request and instructed the team not to cover John's face. Then he personally placed the wet sponge on John's head as the final step of preparation. Just before the execution began, Paul approached John, shook his hand one last time, and said goodbye.
You have to give the order. We're on 2.
Moments later, the current was activated, and John's body convulsed violently until he died. All the guards, knowing that John was an innocent man with a pure heart, couldn't hold back their tears. Years after the incident, Paul told his friend Elaine that John's execution was the last one he ever oversaw. After that, Paul quit his job as head guard, as did his friend David. But when Elaine heard the story, she thought it was just a made-up tale. To prove it, Paul took her to an old cabin in the woods. Inside, he opened a small box, and from it emerged a mouse. It was Mr. Jingles, the same little mouse John had saved years ago. Paul explained that Mr. Jingles was now over 100 years old, thanks to John's healing power. Paul also revealed that part of John's power had been transferred to him when they held hands, which was why he was still alive and healthy despite his old age. But for Paul, living so long was not a blessing, it was a punishment from God for executing one of his miracles sent to the world. He was forced to keep living and watch everyone he loved pass away one by one. In the final scene, Elaine's funeral is shown, while Paul remains alive, living with Mr. Jingles by his side until the end of his days. And that is where the story ends. If you enjoyed this video, don't be shy, hit the like button, and if you disliked it, hit the dislike button twice just to be sure. You should watch the full movie. Thank you very much for watching.